So for our next session, we'll discuss opportunities and issues related to AI and the environment. And that session will be led by my colleague and friend, Dr. Kelly Bronson, who is the Canada Research Chair in Science and Society at the University of Ottawa, and then associate professor in the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa. And she's also the lead of the AI and Environment stream at the AI and Society initiative. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Okay, merci Florian. Am I on? Yes, okay. And thank you everyone, tout le monde. Oh, it's very loud. I'm really pleased to be chairing this session on a topic I feel that in the sort of critical data and AI studies space doesn't get a whole lot of attention as a high-risk use case. Agriculture or agri-food, right? We're used to thinking about the social and ethical, social justice issues raised by autonomous vehicles and weaponry, and the use of data or misuse of data sets, and predictive analytics in banking and health. But people don't very often think about agriculture as raising risks. So we're a group of social scientists who work in this space, and we're really happy to bring this topic to you today. I'm really pleased to introduce my colleagues. Immediately to my left is Tesh Danya, who's a professor and the Ontario Research Chair in Governing AI at York University in Toronto, and also an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at York. Tesh researches the governance of emerging technologies, including big data and AI, focusing on the legal, regulatory, and policy dimensions in the sectors of health, but also in agriculture. And then my colleague Maz Gardisi, who is a faculty member in sociology at Virginia Tech, and who focuses on what he calls smart farming. So that's sort of maybe he'll talk about this, but a broad rubric that is used in the literature, both technical and the social sciences, to talk about the use of digital technologies across the board, from automation of all sorts, to drone imagery, to machine learning. Maz works on smart farming, exploring how AI, in particular machine learning, sensors, and the uses of big data sets can help farmers mitigate and adapt to climate change. But he also looks at some of the social and political inequalities that are potentially reproduced by the use of these systems in the US and in South Asia, in Pakistan in particular. And Maz and I, full disclosure, have some projects that we collaborate on. So I'm really pleased to introduce you both. I thought we would start out with a really general question, because I'm assuming, and maybe it's a false assumption, but I'm assuming that many of you have not necessarily thought about AI in the context of agriculture. I thought I would just open it up and ask you each to speak, if you could, about what you see are potential uses, maybe positive, of the use of AI in particular in the food system, and or some of the social and ethical or legal consequences raised by the application of AI to agriculture. So Tesh, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. And as you can see from the agenda, this is titled AI and Environment. And I am not an environmental lawyer, but I have a particular work focused on agriculture and AI in the context of data governance. But I will speak about the general AI and environment, and then see how that manifests in the specific context of agriculture and what will be the challenge, right? So, I mean, when you talk about AI and environment, it has not been, you can hear me, yeah? It has not been apparent to many people that AI would have an environmental cost, right? So just only 2-3 years ago, Google fired one of its ethicists who wrote a paper on the environmental impact of training AIs, and now more research is coming forward demonstrating. Google itself is reporting just in its latest report saying that its water consumption to cool down those data centers increased by 35% from 2021 to 2022. And there is more research showing that just ChatGPT responding to 62 prompts equals to consume, well, it needs to consume 500 milliliters of water. So you can imagine the resource cost, the environmental cost. The carbon footprint is another matter with these high competing technologies. But that has been all said and noticed and done. But I think it's up to the policymakers to actually whether AI as a sector would be something that would be subject to some environmental assessment or etc. But then I think where I looked at is in the context of the specific applications of AI where it could have and it has a positive impact. So in the context of the environment, AI can be used to facilitate, has been used to facilitate environmental impact assessments for some projects, or in the context of risk assessment in monitoring future forecasts or future. So in the African context where I looked at, there are cases where image recognition technologies are being used to detect crop diseases or to forecast the future, the next, or predict the next crop. That is, so there are some positive ways of using AI in this particular context, and in that sense, we can talk about what are the challenges then. What are the challenges then? At least in the North American context, where Kelly has written a lot about how a modern tractor is fitted with that sensors and all kinds of data collection. In that context, at least we can say that where does that data end up going? And from environmental perspective, who has access to that data? Does the farmer have access to that data? The economic, social perspective of data ownership and access. But from environment perspective, do regulators have access to that data? Do agronomists have access to that data? Do they really have a mechanism of confirming that when the industry promises better environmental outcome by way of precision farming to apply chemicals in a way that responds to the particular soil properties, which is a very good promise to help the environment, less chemicals and all of that. But how can a regulator or an agronomist, an expert, confirm that without having access to that data? And there are lots of data lock-in mechanisms in the context of physical lockup in the cloud, or in legal context of where this all data is a proprietary ownership of commercial data that these corporations own. So I will talk more about the specific problems in the global south perspective, but I think that's a good way to set out the issues, and maybe I will give a chance to Mas to reflect on the question.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, perfect. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for putting this and for all the people and the wonderful conversations we've been having since the last couple of days I've been here. And this has been truly enlightening for me because this is an area that I don't know much about, which is I'm not a legal expert. I'm a social scientist. I have affiliations in the computer science department, in the plant science department, in human-computer interaction. So I dabble into different fields, and what we do is we develop technologies, but we also critique them. So I'm in the middle of doing that. A lot of people ask me, why do I study agriculture? Because I don't come from a farming background. I have absolutely no interest in crop production. And the reason is because there are three reasons. I think the first one is because it's one of the oldest professions for humanity, right? That's how we started to settle down about 10,000 years ago. And so when we want to study artificial intelligence, these new emerging technologies, we are looking at one of the oldest professions in our history of human civilization. The second reason is because agriculture itself is a huge contributor to climate change, right? When you put a fertilizer into the soil, the nitrogen goes up in the atmosphere, turns from nitrogen and turns into nitrous oxide. which is so much more potent than carbon dioxide emissions. When nitrogen goes inside the soil, it mixes with water, it affects water quality, it turns into nitrates and kills life in the water, right? So like there's some really intricate situations that we need to be able to produce more food, but at the same time, we're dealing with these big challenges, such as climate change, which is affecting all of us. And thirdly, because as a social scientist, I deeply believe that we have gone through, as a world together, through a green revolution. Right, and the implications of, and I'm hoping we can have more discussions around it because we have experts on this panel who have been researching this. And the political economy of what we call as smart farming or precision agriculture isn't very different from the previous forms of revolutions that have implicated, I would say, in agriculture. My work is mostly human-AI collaborations, and so when I talk to engineers who I think would be interested in human-AI collaboration, they ask me, can you focus on human-human collaboration? Because we haven't really simplified or understood that in the first place. So a lot of my work is not about building human-AI collaboration, but also understanding human-human collaboration. Because I think we can bring some of the work that we do in social sciences to understanding very simple questions about relationships that we have with each other, with nature, and so on. And so those are, in my view, some kind of big starting points. I do feel that I do work very closely with policymakers. So we design these models that policymakers will eventually use and regulators will eventually use to punish or reward farmers for doing good or bad for the environment. Right? So I'm right in the middle of working with policymakers in designing these models. And I understand the limitations of these models because my students and co-authors are developing that. And I'm very worried about that. Because I feel like there is definitely this idea of performativity applies here, the idea that we don't really know whether these models are accountable, whether somebody else would ever be able to, like if a farmer wants to disagree with the model results, is there a way that they can do that? The issues around compliance, how do you measure things like carbon? University of Ottawa probably has a totally different way of measuring carbon as compared to like Virginia Tech. So all of those things are very much at the center of the work that we're doing. And I would also, another thing that I would like this panel to discuss more is the idea of quantification, because we love to quantify everything. And ecosystem services, ecology, environment are very, very complex systems. So I'll just stop there.
That's great. Am I on? Thank you. And I want to ask you more about your specific projects, Maz, and your human collaboration. But Tesh, I have to thank you for reminding me, as the panel lead, that the theme was actually supposed to be AI and environment, not ag in particular. I think that was really helpful to bring it back to that, because I would hazard a guess that if people have thought about AI and environment or agriculture, they've done so through the lens of maybe infrastructure studies, right? Or thinking about the kind of environmental footprint, as you mentioned, of not just large language models, but video streaming, data centers, data collection efforts. And so that's really important to remind us of that. But then I like what you added, Maz, and you nodded to me, and that is the focus of my work. I look at the environmental impacts that are a little less obvious, and I might even say insidious, in that they're harder to trace the sort of material implications of what I would call the problematic political economy, as Maz put it, of agriculture. So Maz put it kind of lightly, but I would say it this way, that the agri-food sector around the world, but certainly in the global north, it has been big tech before social media. So companies like Monsanto, now Bayer Monsanto, right, were big tech. These are legacy companies that were far more consolidated and wielded a lot of market power in the way that we know now, companies like Meta, speaking to our previous panel. So these were big tech companies before what we now think of as big tech. And that's important because that political economy comes to bear on the social and ethical consequences and environmental consequences raised. And when I say the kind of slow burn consequences, this is what I mean. If we just look at who controls, who collects, who's able to collect most of the farm level data, currently it's companies that have these legacy relationships with farmers. It's companies like John Deere, who at least in North America, right, have the majority of relations with farmers. And just like the proposition of artificial intelligence in other sectors, right, those who are first out of the gate collecting data and building those relationships that enable data collection, right, have a real market advantage in the context of artificial intelligence. So that's just one example where John Deere, right, collects most of the data, has been doing so because they have the vehicle, literally, for data collection, right? Every new John Deere tractor is embedded with hundreds of sensors that collect data from the moment the farmer opens the cab on the vehicle, on the environment, on the laborer, right? And there's a host of data collected, environmental data, that aren't covered under current copyright or privacy legislation, just as one problem. But the slow burn environmental problem for me is that these companies have a vested interest, right? So for example, we know John Deere transfers data to seed and chemical companies like Monsanto. We know this through some sleuthing that's been done and a close reading of the kind that a PhD student in the room of mine, Sarah Marquis, who's waving, has done of license agreements. We know that the data are transferred among machinery and chemical companies. And we know that the chemical companies sell farmers advice based on algorithms putatively that can't be validated, as Maz talked about, right? They're a pernicious black box. We don't have access as critical researchers or regulators to training data or ways to validate the algorithms. And we know from looking at the patterns that in ways that researchers like myself have done, that the companies are promoting chemicals within the same family, ecosystem of products. So there's this vested interest where the chemical companies that are already really powerful and have been for 100 years become more powerful, and they promote a certain kind of farming by promoting tools to farmers that farm in a way we would call kind of large-scale industrial agriculture. And the slow burn environmental problem for me is that that agriculture has known consequences, right? We know the environmental consequences and human health consequences of chemical use, of monocropping, of the impact of heavy machinery on the soil in terms of climate change. So, I mean, for me, the political economy and the social is wrapped up with the environmental. But the infrastructure is a really great reminder that this panel was supposed to be on something broader. Can you talk about some of your work, Tesh, and then Maz, or maybe we should reverse it? Are you okay going first? Yeah. That seeks some redress for some of the issues, either using machine learning, right? And Maz does this in collaboration with computer scientists, and I know you've worked on projects in African countries, or some of your work on governance, for example. How do you try to right some of the wrongs that are historic but are perpetuated by this new technological context?
Right. Yeah. No. So I think in my work, what I looked at is in the context of the global South generally, and in the context of Africa, what the deployment of AI look like, and it can't be on the same rationale or on the same design like AI is being designed in the North, because there are a number of limitations. So the first question is accessibility and infrastructure. Can we have a technology? Do we have a technology that responds to low resource, low bandwidth, and the digital divide context, right? And then what would be the legal policy and governance framework that would facilitate the creation of that adaptable, uniquely suited to that environment context. That's the first thing I looked at. And in that sense, there are a number of, you'll be surprised, in small-scale agricultural context, of course, without this big tech. There are a number of AI-based solutions, AI-powered solutions, like the cassava disease forecast project, looking at image stores in historical pattern to predict the possibility of, or these kinds of initiatives, like all over Africa, solutions, AI solutions. Then the question would be, what would be the direction where these are headed in determining the future of farmers? Maz mentioned about the question of prediction. Are those really based on when a prediction technology that's developed in this northern big context with AI, agricultural input providers, chemical providers input, et cetera, when that is actually, after it's trained in this context, when it's deployed there, does it really provide the right kind of recommendation without getting data limitations? Would it respond to manually collected data from these resource poor or remote regions? Or does it respond to the possibility whereby local adaptation of the technology happens through in a way that the farmers would understand the language in the local sensitive manner? And then most importantly, Kate Crawford was talking about the training data, the epistemological slippage in the training data set. So once this is trained in this industrial-based, large-based agrochemical collaborative context, that technology that being deployed, or so what's happening right now is these companies are actively hunting, Unilever, Bayer, John Deere, they're actively looking toward collaboration with these small AI tech solutions, and they're acquiring them, they're engaging in some. So then the question would be, who is setting the agenda, right? The African governments do not have the resources to define that framework, the priorities, the modalities, the epistemological basis for the agriculture. So then that is being open to these huge companies who have a vested interest in the profit margin. But beyond that, the integration of traditional knowledge in that governance framework, how does that happen? Of course, most of the global south has those small-scale, TK-based, subsistence kind of agriculture. But then when you have that data-based model of production, what does that do to the whole socioeconomic environment? Those are the kind of things I explored in my collaboration with OpenAir. There are a number of countries in Africa designing data control, data governance, privacy rules, talking about data residency approach. How are those effective to respond to the unique circumstance of agriculture, how agriculture has been and how agriculture should be in the future in the global south context? So those are the kind of issues I touched upon.
Just before we go to you, Maz, very briefly, Tesh, will you tell people who don't know about the Open Air project? It was situated from Ottawa, so many people may know, but will you just very briefly say what the project is or was?
The Open Air project is the Open Africa Innovation and Research Project. It is a collaboration between the University of Ottawa and University of Cape Town in South Africa. And there are a number of hubs, research hubs throughout Africa, across almost all regions of Africa. And it has a number of components, but one of the components is to guide the policy making, the legislative making in a way that responds to the African context, the way innovation happens in Africa, in the context of intellectual property, or recently in the context of regulation. How is regulation happening? What does innovation mean? Regulating innovation in the African context has different meaning from regulating innovation in the global north context. So it's a project that has been in place for more than 10 years, and it has a number of training, research, and capacity building components. And there are the project leaders among us, Chidu Ogumanam, Tobias is there, Caroline is there, and there are a number of other participants as well. So that's what the Open Air is, and I have been affiliated with them for a long period of time from the intellectual property side in the context of using particular intellectual property tools in my previous project, exploring how, for example, geographical indications could be designed or redesigned to respond to the economic context of African countries in specific case studies. So that's what Open Air is. I might have not said everything that needs to be said, but
No, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks so much. I want to come back to some of the things you mentioned, like the digital divide, and what I'm hearing you call the epistemology. I might call it the kind of partiality within the current data sets and the models and algorithms being used in the agri-food context in global south and north. But first, Maz, so I know that you have lots of projects, but some of them, or maybe in all of them, as you said, you are trying to sort of harness the power, is that the right way to put it, of machine learning to address some of the environmental or socio-environmental issues in agriculture, climate crisis being the big one. But also you study, right, the potential limitations, as you put it, and maybe even some of the risks. And so you're sort of doing both in these interdisciplinary. Will you talk about your work?
Sure. So we do work in this broad framework called the responsible innovation. And there was some discussion about responsible AI. And so those are principles that drive, that can possibly drive, like more collaborative AI development.
For people who don't know RRI, can you mention the principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Kelly, you're like a better person to talk about RI than me. But basically the ideas are that, that through inclusion and early engagement with a wide range of stakeholders, and especially those that are going to be implicated as a result of technological development, bringing them into the process of design itself, and then and seeing how that has an impact in the way technologies are developed. And so there's a lot of that is based on inclusion as one of the principles, and I know there were some really wonderful discussions about inclusion yesterday, and so we study all that as social scientists. We understand, we value those things, and the other thing that we really value is participatory research. Right? And like really core participatory research starts with the fundamental question, which is, I do not know, what should I be researching on? Right? So when we work with the communities that we work with, we ask them, please tell us, give us a research question. And they give us a research question, and a lot of times it's very different from the research questions that we're interested in, right? But we try to get to some way in which those questions can be addressed. And I can give you specific examples and so on. But one of the big problems I feel with doing participatory research, there are several big issues, but one of them is when you are dealing with emerging technologies, you don't really know whether artificial intelligence is actually going to be doing what you intended it to do. It slows down the process of actually doing research. One of the projects I have is a 4-year project. We're supposed to finish it in 4 years. We still are somewhere. I don't know. So participatory research requires a lot of flexibility because community needs change over time, right? And this is something that your team has to be able to adapt to. A lot of people that I work with aren't traditionally taught to behave or understand those dynamics. So I think there were some discussions I've had in this conference with people who are interested in working in engineering education, like to talking to them about the needs for engaging with community. So I think like a lot of the research I do is a very slow process, a very reflexive process, and reflexivity is another principle of responsible innovation. What can we learn from the work that we do, and how can we develop capacities to be able to do better over time, which is responsiveness. Okay? So responsible innovation in general is a very slow process. It requires institutional support, sometimes which the funding agencies do not provide or understand. The universities don't necessarily know, because why aren't you publishing? Why isn't the AI model out already? Why aren't you commercializing it? Why are you going for open science instead? So the incentives need to be built around responsible innovation, right? So a lot of work that I do now over time has moved away from trying to understand these nuances to going out and speaking to people to get this work done. And that's why working with policymakers and regulators has been truly informative for me, because I think that's probably the way in which you can make some serious changes by working with them and thinking of them as users and designing technologies that they can eventually use, but also showing them the limitations of those technologies. And one of the ways we show those limitations is similar to the design workshop that we were all part of this morning. So we use very qualitative methods like that, but we also do very complex system dynamic models that can showcase the complexity of all the different trade-offs that are implicated when you make a policy decision. So we rely a lot on different kinds of approaches, And finally, we believe that ethnographic research, qualitative, like deeply ethnographic research, can have a lot of impact, especially if your team is willing to learn from being observed, personally observed. So those are some of the ways in which.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I would say that those two pillars or principles central to responsible research and innovation that you mentioned, inclusion. What was the second one you mentioned? Reflexivity? No.
Anticipation.
Oh, anticipation. Well, so there's three, and then reflexivity is the fourth. But I would say you stage them in your work, right? Using methodologies not unlike the one that we used as a whole group this morning, that folks like Jason Miller use in his work, and I use those same methodologies in my work, some of them. So I wanted to come back to the comment that Tesh made about the digital divide, because I think, and then your comment, Maz, about using these, what Jason calls design prompts, right? In your case, gaming or storytelling. I use cartooning, right? But also just the general participatory approach to try to work with people really upstream to get at, okay, what are your technological needs? Tesh, you mentioned the digital divide in the Global South. And there's been quite a bit of writing, even by supranational agencies like the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the World Bank, the OECD, about the potential digital divide, right? That if tools like AI are to hold promise, or digital tools like, as you said, the smartphone, right? And that we need to sort of broaden access to internet technologies, but also to other digital tools. And so I would say that at least in my view, that digital divide conversation is a pretty well-stocked conversation when it comes to agriculture in the Global South. But it's one that actually doesn't get a whole lot of attention in terms of the possible digital divides facing farmers in the Global North. And so I have a project that's similar to the work that Maz does, where we sort of began focusing on a group of farmers that don't get a lot of attention in the industry, but also policy conversation around smart farming, as you put it, or AI and ag. And that's really small-scale biodiverse farms. So these are farms about 100 acres, which by Ontario standards, that's pretty average. But if you go to Midwestern Canada, that's absolutely minuscule. And so, basically there's this bias, right, in the policy attention, the subsidizing, the funding for smart agriculture, and also the industry attention, where farmers of a certain scale are not really being envisioned as a potential market or people to engage in the so-called smart farm revolution. So all this to say, similar to what we did this morning, and following on your point, Maz, about working with community, in this project, we started with these farmers, and we started by opening things. We went way upstream, and we said, what is digital agriculture to you? Or what is innovation? And these were workshops where we used techniques like storyboarding with policymakers. And we were so surprised because the policymakers had clear ideas, like the precision tractor, the John Deere tractor, or the machine learning app, the algorithm that can deliver advice on when to seed or spray or harvest. But for these small-scale farmers, they said, no, digital agriculture to us is social media. Because we actually need communication tools that connect us with markets. Our biggest problem is that we don't export on the international commodity markets, right? We need direct or semi-direct access to markets. And so the tools that we need support for are communication tools. And so, but it was really eye-opening, I think, especially for the policymakers at the table and the technologists, to take it way back, just to illustrate your point. But it is very time-consuming and messy to do that kind of work. Okay, my last question to you is about, it sort of follows from this. I work on using the digital divide concept on different avenues for access, and I would say partialities, bias, in the design of tools in North America and Europe. You've worked on the same issue in the Global South. My view is that there's these two great conversations happening related to the conference theme on the social, ethical, justice dimensions of AI in agriculture, but they're happening in two separate, they're happening not conversing with one another, right? There's great people working in the Global South like yourself talking about data colonialism and access and justice. And then in the North, we're not talking to one another. Do you share in that view? And do you think would be some merit in bringing these conversations together?
Yeah, well, my answer is yes and no, in a sense that, yes, I see that divide myself as well in my work, and somehow it's justified because there are some unique situations by which these concepts we talk about are expressed in the Global South. When we talk about inclusion, what are we talking about in the Global South context? We are talking about diversity of language, we are talking about adaptability to local environment, we are talking about cultural appropriateness in some context. So all those notions exist in that context where agriculture is being somehow, well, assisted or dictated by technologies, right? So then on the other hand, in the global north, when it comes to environmental issues in the AI design, the ways by which AI is being used is completely different in a sense that there are more carbon footprints in the way AI is being used. AI is being used to extract more fossil fuel, or in advertisements that would be consuming a lot of energy, which science proved is a major cause for contributor to climate change. So there are, when you talk about the same things, environmental concerns in agriculture or in AI's use in Africa, so in that sense, I understand why the agenda could be different, but I see where the two can go hand in hand in their own way, but have some collaborative voice where, we will have an agenda on, let's say, if it's environment, we'll have an environment, recognizing environmental protection as an aspect of AI governance. That could be something we can come around, and that happens through when if it's an environmental justice question, it's about ensuring equality of environmental outcomes. So that will start by bringing people to the table together where these conversations happened, which happened today. So in this context, in international environmental governance as well, or agricultural discussion with FAO or with whichever, there could be rooms for that kind of technical collaboration whereby these identified goals could be pursued in an equal, mutually reinforcing and united voice. But on the other hand, that's just the weakness in a sense that we seem to have our own agenda pursuing separately, and that's probably not necessarily a bad thing in a sense. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Maz, have anything to
Yeah, so I'm gonna try to philosophize a little bit, so I apologize. I'm generally not a very good theorist, but I've been thinking about this idea for some time, and I would I'll agree with you, but also I'm gonna challenge all of us to think differently. I feel like there is I don't necessarily agree with the global north-south distinction. I feel like there's a lot more, but I think that's for another discussion. But anyway, so the question of scale is very important from a technology developer perspective, from a government's perspective. And generally, how do we think about scale is something that unifies everybody right now, unfortunately. I'm going to talk about why that's unfortunately. We think about scale in terms of progress and growth. It's like growth equals to progress, and that's how if we want to scale up a technology or we want to scale up the impacts of technology, we believe that we need to do more of what you're already doing, right? And that's how technology companies pitch ideas to venture capitalists, and they get the money. They're like, okay, we want to be able to get to 40,000 customers in 2 years, and so on and so forth, right? there are other ways, because I do work with Kelly and other people in other parts of the world, like in Pakistan and South Asia and broadly. And in Africa as well, we think about scale differently, right? There is a scale which is called the knowledge scale that goes all the way from Western knowledge to very local knowledge, right? There's another scale which is called the time scale, which goes from very long time periods to very short time periods, right? So science, like the Western science that we study in these institutions, they like to speed up the process, right? So they're focusing on scale, time scale, as trying to speed up the process of innovation to be able to get the results, whether it's in health, whether it's in agriculture, food production. We want to get the ecological impacts, the food production impacts quickly. When I speak to indigenous communities in Pakistan, they tell me that they've been doing all this for centuries. The only difference is that it takes them much longer to achieve impact. Okay, so that's the second type of scale that we generally don't think about, which I think is important for governance, and I'll come to that in just a moment. And the third one, I think, is the idea that, and there's a really interesting book that came out maybe in 2019, published here in Canada by IDRC, and it talks about scaling impact. I don't know if anyone's read that book, but I would definitely recommend it, because it says that it's not really, the focus shouldn't be on scaling innovation, the focus should be the scaling the impact of innovation. Right? And so I would like to take back and think about governance. And now coming to governance, I think there are two things that are totally happening right now in the area of climate change, in the area of digital technologies in agriculture and food systems. One is governance of technology, right? Which, you were just mentioning that, data governance, how do we develop intellectual property, copyright laws. And the other is governance through technology, which is, we've seen that in policing and in other industries like insurance, we've seen that in housing, and governance through technology is also something that I would like to discuss more, especially as we think about issues of scale. And so, very high level, sorry, but I think those are ideas I'm trying to develop, and if you have any.
I'd like to have just one point
Yeah.
here. I mean, I understand that, especially the distinction between scale of impact, scaling up of impact and scaling up of innovation. And I think that from governance perspective, the question is, do we want to have an innovation system that is scaled up to address all the problems of the world, and then, or do we want to have a scaling up of innovation that address multiple problems in their own local contexts? And then that again comes back to as legal scholars, we're going to think about who owns and directs and controls that impact or innovation. What are the modalities Kelly was talking about in the agricultural sector, where that increased consolidation, that increased concentration in one sector, what impact does that have in the context of scale-up, right? So I think there is, if it's a technology controlled, scaled up by these corporations that have a vested interest in its ultimate outcome, impact would have different meaning, right? So that's the point I want to make. But then I agree, scaling up has that kind of different understanding, and not in the way we understand, scientists understand what to be, right?
I really like this point, Tesh, because it reminds me of something that Kate Crawford said, maybe it was Katie, anyway, in the conversation on Wednesday night about technocracy. I mean, you didn't put it this way, but right, we see this, that there's this, industry-led conversation around governance, I would put it. Even in the genre of the open letter or white papers, right? Think about, if there's an open letter, what's closed? and why is there something that's behind closed doors, right? Because only we need to know. Anyway, not to get philosophical, as you say, Maz. But I feel like there's, what you mentioned, Tesh, in terms of who's able to participate, and you said it too, Maz, in the governance conversation. We don't think about that often in the ag and AI context, but it's a real problem, because globally, right? These are transnational corporate, which is, I guess, where I was going with the question. You're right, I set up a kind of problematic dichotomy, global north-south, but my thought was that just scholarly, there's these different conversations happening, especially around governance maybe, right? Where, in the Global South, there's just great research. Many of their colleagues at the Open Air Project have published on this, about different models of data sharing. So for those of you who don't know, the data collected by a tractor is not accessible to the farmer who helps to collect those data. But there is, and that's, so that's a distinction between the agricultural context and, say, social media platforms. Another distinction is that the farmer then pays for advice that's putatively driven or produced by those data. So there are a number of ways where the farmer pays, right? And then on top of that, there's that potential incommensurate gain by the corporation, not just through those fees and licenses, but also, again, through the recommendation of products in-house, right, that fuel basically the development of a particular direction for agriculture that has harmed socially and environmentally. But I feel like in the Global South, there have been great reports, scholarship, but also real on-the-ground moves made to produce alternative governance tools like data sharing agreements, data cooperatives, right? And so I guess that's what I was thinking, where that hasn't been a part of the conversation among scholars, but also among regulators, policymakers, focused in Europe and North America. Our solution right now is a third-party organization called Ag Data Transparent that's voluntary, or it's a kind of regulation by it's just all voluntary. It's what Michael Geist calls virtue signaling, or maybe that's not his, but so right. And so I feel like there's been all this great learning in the Global South, but for some reason we're not applying that broadly in the Global North. And yet, Maz mentioned the Green Revolution, right? These are powerful transnational corporations. Yes, they've wielded violent, right, effects in the Global South, not quite the same at all in North America. So there's that difference. So there's technological differences. There's differences for sure. But these are powerful transnational. This is a political economy that's problematic around the world. And so maybe we can learn. I guess I'm just hoping that we can converse more, all of us, and learn from each other.
Right. So in the context of data governance, for example, how it should be designed in the African context, or something I looked at, and there are different models that we explore globally in terms of, then actually just basing on Ma's point about encouraging people-to-people innovation, work, collaboration, does that data governance regime really allow a collaborative work project between the communities, individuals in the communities, as well as these NGOs, non-governmental actors, as well as government actors? And what I saw in one particular case was there is, for example, this company, what's called the Grameen Foundation, is a kind of NGO, but non-profit, but with some collaboration with these big agri-techs. It actually has a project called Farmers Profiling or Farmers Profile Project, and it invests a lot in going to each house and collecting detailed data, and then that data for it is just a resource. And in any context, then there will be data sharing agreement, and it becomes proprietary, owned by and stored in San Francisco over the cloud, and then the government, the regulatory agencies wouldn't have access to that data. The farmers later on, if a technology develops based on that data, they would only get the final output, but they wouldn't get, and then there are a number of other issues. There is a gender dimension to it. Most of those farmers who work on the land do not have land tenure. Most of them are women, and the men who don't actually work on the farm would. So there are a number of issues that a properly designed and crafted data governance framework could serve. but then it won't be in the same way that we talk about it here in the north, right? So, yeah.
So some of the issues may be shared, but of course the approach both to technology design, appropriate technology, but also governance ought to be different and bespoke. 2 minutes on governance. I'm getting the wrap-up sign, and then we'll go to questions. What do you want to say about governance, Mas?
What do I want to say about governance in 2
Go.
minutes? I worry that, I think you have a very optimistic view of what's happening because in my view, I worry that data are being put behind enclosures in the so-called global south as well. Like whether it's agriculture data, it's very difficult to get open access satellite data, which is high resolution in many parts of the world, especially in the poor parts of the world. But I feel that if there is, and when I ask people, like, where do I get farm data? I mean, you would imagine I just take a guess who would have it. It's the fertilizer company who has data about farmers. It's the banks who have data about farmers.
IBM has a lot of data.
IBM has, so like there are certain companies that have a lot of data and they're trying to protect it. So I think, anyways, I think like in terms of governance, I've been thinking about ways in which like AI regulation in broadly speaking, that could encompass not just, I think it might have to go all the way to space governance if you're looking at questions about agriculture and environment, especially because some of the work I do is around early warning and early hazard systems. So space governance is maybe an area where there has to be some more discussions around how do you get more satellites that can provide information that's freely available, and then how do you develop an innovation ecosystem in those countries that train people to be able to use that data. But I think that those discussions aren't really where they should be. But.
No, I think that's great. And I think that comes back to our broad theme, the environment, because when you think about environmental data, there's a host of data that are collected agriculturally, but also just in terms of environmental data that are being enclosed, as you say, and what are the appropriate, for all the lawyers in the room, right? What are the tools that can help us address those enclosures? Because those data could be really helpful, right, for addressing some of our environmental problems. So I think that's that knowledge asymmetry in enclosure is a big legal problem. So I think I got the wrap-up sign. I want to invite you to thank our panelists and ask for questions. Do we have time for questions? Do we have? So, yeah, if anyone has questions, please, Chidi.
So I just want to thank the panel. And Kelly, I'll surprise you by not engaging in this global north-south discussion. For Tesh and Mas, I'm wondering, when you talk about technologies that actually acquire and process data on farmlands, and the current framework for access and beneficiary, and I was wondering if you have actually thought about, when we talk about privacy by design, and in the context of AI, applying it to agricultural farmlands, could we even stretch the logic a little bit to talk about co-creation of knowledge by design? Because the current framework for access and benefit sharing, kind of casts the farmer as a dormant actor in this space. But if from the onset, the John Deere's of this world are designing an AI device to go to the farmland, whereof we now know that they're acquiring data that does not belong to them, and then they lock it up and begin to put tolls upon it. Could we not imagine a co-creation of knowledge concept? And so that from the get-go of this design, we should be able to be looking at farmers as co-creators of data in that space, just for the purpose of equity. Thank you.
Do you want?
Yeah, I can go first. I guess in terms of my very limited knowledge about privacy is that in the US, for instance, the Federal Trade Commission thinks about agriculture, or Section 14 specifically, right, talks about agriculture data as a non-personalized data, and for that reason, it doesn't give it the same protection as it protects you and my data, because it's farm data. It's like soil doesn't belong to a human, those kind of ideas, which needs to be revised. Please, go ahead, do it. And so I think that I really like the idea of privacy by design in terms of like how we can co-create solutions with farmers and I think over there, like there is, like there has to be a way in which we can bring in, again, like I'm thinking more about open science, ways in which we can start using more satellites and sensors that are freely available in the sky. But also I think technology has a role to play in that as well. Like in our project, we use what is called differential privacy. And the basic idea of differential privacy is that, like, if me and Tesh and Kelly we put our data into one repository, but I can only access my data, he can only access. And so there are some technological ways in which you can do that through by design, right? I feel like when the conversations are with farmers in the global south, they're not concerned about privacy in particular. What they're concerned about are like all the stuff that, like you already know. So it's not such a big issue right now. That's how I feel about it, but I'm sure like somebody may disagree with me on that.
Not disagreeing, but I think in the context of privacy, even we have to think about what does privacy mean in the way we understand it here, privacy as autonomy or privacy as a right to be left alone versus disclosure of data. Then what system of governance do these the global south countries or have by way of legal mechanism? Now, I think that is a good way to think about how to conceptualize that in that broader context of collaborative data collection. But my problem when it comes to privacy really is not so much about, of course, agricultural data could become private data because whatever data you can infer based on, it will eventually identify the farmer, it will identify the farm, then it will be like, given the way AI has developed, for sure agricultural data could become attached to personal identifiable data in some ways. And really that's not the question. The question, the problem, the challenge most people, at least from innovation perspectives, these tech startups, these AI solution indigenous or local innovators are encountering is a big corporation would say, we don't give you access to this data because we really worry about the privacy implications for farmers. And in actual cases, the farmers want that co-creation, collaborative sharing of the data. Like that's where they are really interested in. Aspects of that data is an expression of traditional knowledge, and it has that communal sense. But then these proprietors or these companies would use privacy by design or by law as a means of enclosure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's where really the problem is. It's not really actual privacy of the farmer even.
Yeah, I agree. I talk about that in my book, how the privacy legal tools are actually being weaponized by the agribusinesses. Mm-hmm. I would say that unlike that context, the interviews I've done for a book project with farmers across North America, privacy is center of mind, right? Because data on crop type, seeding data, for example, or data on the machinery or on chemical use could be used to identify farms and also could have competitiveness effects on individual the large-scale corporate farms in North America. So that's an interesting context. Okay, I'm being told we have time for one question, but can I do something cheeky? Can the three people who are standing ask your question really briefly, and then we may not have time to answer it, but at least everyone gets to hear your good questions?
Okay, thank you. My name is Alex. I'm a PhD student. So my question is regarding regulating artificial intelligence in agriculture and general. So there are presumptions or just factual realities, big corporates versus small states, and few corporates versus huge or billion populations, and also big money versus very small capacity of states even. So in such a reality, there is a power, knowledge formation, power structure setup, and finally a discourse establishment. In such a reality, founding a reality, how farmers, mostly in Africa, can have an access of economical benefit from their data even, in which the big corporates manipulate and just take over and even establish a discourse against them as a society and destroying their values. So can you have any thought about that? Economical benefit and remedial just accessibility at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
That's great. I love it. As Kate Crawford said, and I said in my book, it's power all the way down for me. And I think one of the most radical things we can do in the ag space or otherwise is to ask what stays the same, right? The prior panel, right? In what ways do these new technologies just advance really old norms like the objectification of women? Okay, questions, sorry.
I'm wondering if you've looked at the technological innovations of small-scale farmers for inspiration. I'm thinking of the farming community around Wakefield, where I think 6-7 years ago, people were organizing workshops to build Arduino-based greenhouse management systems. So open source systems for managing your own greenhouses without paying somebody to keep your data.
That's who's in my book. That's great. That's who's in my book.
Okay, the book, yes.
But I'd love to talk to you about the farm hack folks and yeah.
Buy the book.
But no. I have, just talk to me about the book.
Quick. I was just wondering, so there's for big companies that own the data, there's not really many incentives to share it. Like models are getting better, which means that the data is becoming more valuable. Not only that, we're adding more and more regulations that actually punish people that have data, so we have all these privacy laws that have come up. And so it seems to me I don't know, you guys are mentioning it, that the solution to a lot of our problems is making this data more accessible, but there's so many checks that are actually making it less, make the companies less willing to actually share that data. And so I'm just wondering thinking trajectory, where we're going. So it's going to be worth more and more. There's no economic incentive. So what do you think we should do as lawyers in developing this regime so that we don't continue to actually, like you said, they're weaponizing actually this privacy stuff. And if you're going to bring more and more regulations on this, it's going to make it worse and worse. So what do you think about that, and how do we attack that so you can solve these problems for many businesses?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's great. I feel not one of us is a lawyer, but we can talk about the ways in which the companies are creating value from data. Do you? I feel like we should. We said no answering the questions.
Okay,
we're going to talk to you about, and you're going to tell us what you can do over lunch.
Yeah, we will talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, very much.
Thanks.